Welcome to a place where history whispers you to sleep. This is Sleep Whisperer, where every story is told in hushed tones, not to awaken, but to help you rest. If gentle storytelling helps you sleep, please like this video and consider subscribing for more. Now, close your eyes. Let the noise of the day fade. As we travel back to a time of silks, shadows, and silent power, to a palace where one man held a quiet and deadly duty, the royal food taster. Tonight, we enter the court of the Ottoman Empire, where every meal could be the last. Imagine, the year is 1570. The air is warm and thick with the scent of rosewater. Somewhere, beyond the great marble walls of Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, the Sultan prepares for his meal. But before he lifts a spoon, someone else must taste it. The Ottoman court was more than a seat of power. It was a world unto itself, an enclosed, silent city, ruled not only by the Sultan, but by an invisible network of advisors, eunuchs, scribes, guards, and slaves. Each day began before sunrise. The palace would stir slowly to life, as the first call to prayer echoed from the city's minarets. Servants would sweep the courtyards in silence. Water jugs would be filled, and deep within the kitchens, dozens of cooks would begin preparing the first of many meals for the imperial household. The palace was a place of perfect order. Every man and woman knew their rank. Every task, no matter how small, was a reflection of the Sultan's glory. The Sultan himself was rarely seen, yet his presence was everywhere. From the polished silver serving dishes to the layered silk rugs beneath every step, the court existed to serve, protect, and elevate him. But grandeur came with danger. For all its beauty, the palace was a place of constant intrigue. Brothers plotted against brothers, viziers whispered behind closed doors, and at the heart of it all was food. Poison had long been a favored tool of silent assassination. A drop in a drink, a powder on a fig, a subtle bitterness in a stew. In an empire of 1,000 whispers, the Sultan's next bite could be his last. And so the role of the food taster was born. Not a soldier, not a spy, but a man trained to eat, so the Sultan might live. He was quiet, obedient, almost invisible, but his presence meant the difference between life and death. In this video, we will walk with him, through hidden hallways, into marble kitchens, and beside the golden trays of the empire. We will discover what it meant to taste danger, one bite at a time. Long before the Ottomans rose, the fear of poison already haunted the palaces of kings. Because power, true power, always invites betrayal. From the lavish feasts of ancient Persia to the marble dining halls of Rome, rulers feared what lay hidden in their next bite. Not because food was scarce, but because trust was. The role of the food taster did not begin in Istanbul. It was born in shadows wherever crowns were heavy and enemies silent. History remembers them, these silent guardians, not as warriors, not as scholars, but as living shields. Men and women whose job was to risk their lives with every swallow. There were poison rings in Renaissance Italy. There were nightshade plots in Byzantine courts. Even Cleopatra was said to have tested her poisons on slaves. But in the Ottoman Empire, this fear became a system, an institution, a quiet ritual before every meal. If the taster lived, the Sultan ate. A full pause. Let this sentence breathe. And so the role endured, not for fame, not for wealth, but because fear, the silent companion of power, never truly sleeps. Tonight, we remember them. Not the kings, but the watchers, the tasters, the men who swallowed silence. In the great halls of the Ottoman court, Loyalty was measured not in words, but in survival. And those chosen to guard the Sultan's plate did not volunteer. You didn't apply to be a royal food taster. There were no public invitations, no titles passed down. To be selected, you had to be watched. The court had eyes everywhere, watching how you walked, how you listened, how you reacted when no one was supposed to be watching. A candidate might begin as a kitchen apprentice, slicing herbs, cleaning pots, moving in silence through steam and flame. But if they were calm, cautious, invisible, they might rise. The perfect food taster was not brave. They were forgettable, unemotional, quiet, more shadow than man. Once noticed, they were moved into a different kind of training. Not public, not spoken of, but deliberate. They were taught how to observe, not just food, but people, to study the body language of chefs, to know the scent of spoiled meat, to recognize a tremor in a cook's hand, or a change in the usual spices. They also learned about poisons, not to wield them, but to suffer them. They drank tinctures in small doses, built resistance, knew what each poison felt like, how fast it burned, what it did to the tongue, the throat, the heart. And then came the hardest test of all, loyalty. They were offered gold, tempted with fake conspiracies, threatened with the execution of family members, not to punish them, but to see if they would speak or stay silent. If a man could resist gold, pain, and fear, perhaps he was ready to taste for the Sultan. There was no ceremony, no celebration. One day, you were told to enter the Sultan's chamber and stand near the food. That was it. You were now his shield, his silence, his trust. And trust, in the palace, was rare. Every day after was a gift, but one easily taken away. Beyond the velvet doors of the royal court, behind the gold-leafed halls and glittering throne rooms, lied a world just as vital, just as powerful, but far less seen. Topkapı's palace kitchens were not just for cooking. They were a machine. And like all machines, they ran on order, silence, and precision. The kitchens covered more than 20 vast rooms, built with stone walls thick enough to muffle screams. Domed ceilings lifted heat away from the men below, and chimneys whispered out the evidence of royal feasts. Each day began before the sun rose, with footsteps, hundreds of them, cooks, stewards, bakers, and apprentices arriving in waves. There were no shouted orders, voices were low, movements rehearsed. The head chef, known as the Matba Emini, oversaw it all. He didn't speak often. He didn't need to. Every man in that kitchen knew his role and the cost of forgetting it. Under him were ranks, bakers for bread, cooks for meat, sweet makers for desserts served only to the highest born. And further down, the apprentices, quiet, invisible, always watching. Nothing was improvised. Even the most delicate meal for the Sultan had to be prepared the same way, every time. The olive oil had a specific route through the palace. The honey came from a specific region. The saffron weighed precisely to the grain. Every tray passed through checkpoints. Every dish logged. Every cook observed. And at the very end of this silent chain stood the royal food taster. He never cooked. He never helped. But his eyes missed nothing. If a servant was slow that day, if a spice smelled faintly off, if a cook seemed nervous, he would know. The kitchens were not just where food was made. They were where trust was tested, where conspiracies could begin or end, where one wrong turn meant execution. In the palace, food was life. But in the kitchens, it was politics, poison, and power, disguised in steam and spice. He dressed in silence, not in silk like the courtiers, not in armor like the guards, but in a simple tunic, crimson, edged in black, the color of caution and consequence. His uniform bore no rank, but everyone in the palace knew what it meant. He wasn't a noble. He wasn't a servant. He was the line between indulgence and death. Each day began before the kitchen stirred. He would inspect the fire pits, smell the air for poison or fear. He'd nod to the guards posted at storage rooms. Silent agreements passed between them. Nothing unusual. No bribes, no strangers. He kept to a strict rhythm, not for efficiency, but to be predictable. Because in a palace full of plots, any change in pattern could invite death. Cleanliness was sacred. Hands washed with rose water, mouth rinsed, fingernails checked. This was not only about hygiene, but about presence. A ritual that reminded him his body was the first to meet danger. Each meal passed through a silent ballet, prepared, sealed, brought to a private chamber. There, in silence, he would begin. The tasting was slow, deliberate, not just to detect poison, but to feel texture, weight, aftertaste. Was the spice slightly off? Was the heat wrong for this time of year? Suspicion didn't need evidence, only instinct. He ate from every dish, but not too much. A bite here, a sip there. Then he waited. 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. He sat still, listening to his own breath, to the whispers in the hallway, to the silence that could mean safety or the beginning of a very slow end. Only when the silence held and his body gave no protest was the food delivered to the Sultan. He never spoke to the Sultan, never looked him in the eye. But he protected him more closely than any sword ever could. This process repeated 5 times a day, for every meal, snack, sip of sherbet, or sweet gift sent by a foreign dignitary. He lived in patterns, a quiet, measured life built around someone else's survival. There were no celebrations, no gratitude, only another dish. Another hour. Another chance to die, so someone else could die. He had no laboratory, no microscope, no vials of bubbling chemicals. What he had was tradition, old knowledge, passed from one cautious generation to the next. This was not science as we know it today, but something older, half observation, half omen. He began with his eyes. Did the broth shine strangely in the light? Was the meat too pale or too red? Next, the nose. A scent too sharp, too bitter, too sweet. These were warnings. Some poisons hid in sweetness, others in musty decay. Then the tongue. Not to swallow, not yet. Just a touch. He looked for metallic bitterness, a numbing tingle, a burning sensation where there should be none. He wore a ring of silver, not for beauty, but because it was said that silver tarnished in the presence of deadly substances. When the ring darkened too quickly, he did not drink. He carried threads of silk to dip into wine or soup. If the silk stiffened, the old tales said danger was near. There were tools, yes, but many of them came from superstition, and still they sometimes worked. He watched for unnatural reactions. A candle that sputtered near the food. A drop of oil that spread too fast. Steam that burned the eyes. These weren't facts, but they were signs. And sometimes, signs were enough to live. He studied poisons in secret. Nightshade, wolfsbane, hemlock. He memorized symptoms: burning throat, blurred vision, sudden vomiting, even cold fingertips. But poisons were tricky. They could mimic illness or strike hours after tasting. So the food taster needed not just knowledge, but patience and a quiet sense of dread. Not all poisons came from powders or plants. Some were in the way the food was handled. A knife dipped in venom. A servant paid with gold. So he learned the people as well as the food. Who was nervous? Who avoided eye contact? Who fumbled with a plate at the wrong moment? Suspicion was his sharpest tool. He had no title, but his senses were his armor. Sight, smell, taste, instinct, memory. Every dish was a test. Every meal a quiet interrogation. Let the golden candlelight return. Let us drift now, deeper into the marble corridors of the Ottoman Palace, to a quieter place, a room tucked behind the bustling kitchens, where the taster prepared not only his senses, but his tools. Because tasting for the Sultan was never just about the tongue. Here we find a table, polished wood, with no ornament, laid out like a surgeon's stand. Each item, specific, functional, trusted. The silver spoon. The most iconic of the taster's tools, and not by accident. Silver was more than a luxury. The ancients believed it had purifying qualities, that it would react to certain poisons. A blackened silver spoon might warn of arsenic. A subtle discoloration could spell danger. Was it scientific? Not quite. But in a world where poison was invisible, any sign was better than none. And so, every taster in Topkapı carried a silver spoon, polished until it shimmered like moonlight. 1 point. The more importantly, copper trays were easy to clean, easy to inspect. You see, any trace of powder, liquid, even a hair out of place, might mean sabotage. The taster would inspect the tray before every meal, running a finger along the rim, checking the grooves. Nothing was left to chance. Clean towels and white linens, folded precisely, always white. They were used to wipe utensils, to cover dishes before unveiling, and to blot the mouth after each test. But more than that, they were symbolic. White meant purity, cleanliness, order. To be a food taster was to embody discipline. Every gesture had its place. Every fold was deliberate. ceramic bowls, and burnished pitchers. Water was essential, not just for cleansing, but for resetting the palate. Between each dish, the taster would sip water, often infused with mint or lemon to clear the tongue. This, too, was ritual. The pitcher, usually made of burnished copper or glazed ceramic, would be kept nearby, poured by a steward, who, too, was trusted and trained. Candle tests. In some eras, testers would burn a sliver of the food over a charcoal flame, to smell it, to observe the smoke. Some poisons, they believed, would burn with a strange scent, or a peculiar hue. Candles were used in a similar way. A drop of wine or soup near the flame. If the flame flickered wildly or sputtered, they took it as a sign. These were old beliefs, half superstition, half caution. But when your life hung in the balance, superstition was just another kind of safety. Taste logs and observation notes. Rarely spoken of, but often kept, were the taster's logs, small notebooks wrapped in leather or linen. In them, tasters recorded strange tastes, reactions, or patterns. If the Sultan complained of nausea the next day, the taster's notes might be consulted. Some entries were as simple as, stew, slightly bitter, possible overuse of sumac, no effect. Others were chilling, aftertaste metallic, discarded. Cook questioned. Seals and signatures. To protect against tampering, some dishes arrived sealed. A thin wax stamp over the lid, or a thread tied across a bowl's opening. Only the taster or his superior could break the seal. These small details mattered, because betrayal often came not with a scream, but with a gentle clink of porcelain. The taster's knife, small, curved, kept close to the body, used not for defense, but for splitting fruit, cutting bread, scraping a surface for residue. It was always sharp, always clean, and when not in use, it was wiped, folded into cloth, and returned to the belt. Clothing as a tool. Even the taster's uniform was part of the role. Loose robes in natural fibers, often white or muted earth tones. Wide sleeves rolled tightly before testing. A sash at the waist to carry tools. The idea was simple. No pockets, no hiding places, no stains or lingering scents from another meal. He was to be as blank as the towel he carried. The taster's hands. Perhaps the most overlooked tool were his hands. They were trained to feel for temperature, texture, weight. A dish too hot or too cold might raise alarm. They would gently press bread, lift grains, test meat for consistency. It was tactile intuition. These hands were instruments of survival, when tools were not enough. But even with all this, there were no guarantees. The spoon, the tray, the towel. They were guardians, yes, but the ultimate barrier was trust, because no silver spoon could shield against a cup passed by a friend. In the next chapter, we leave the tools behind and walk into the darker chambers of fear itself, where whispers of poison moved faster than the breeze, and no one, not even the Sultan, felt safe. The grandeur of the Ottoman court was gilded with silk, perfumed with rosewater, and shadowed by fear. In the echoing halls of Topkapı Palace, whispers could travel faster than servants, and few whispers traveled farther than those of poison. The Ottomans, like many empires before and after them, knew that the path to power was often littered with betrayal. A cup of sherbet, a delicate stuffed grape leaf, or a bowl of saffron rice could carry not just spices, but a silent death. While no surviving records officially list every instance, stories abound of sultans, viziers, and rivals falling to suspicious ailments. Murad III, for instance, was rumored to be deeply paranoid, constantly switching food servers, avoiding specific meals, and relying on multiple food tasters. Some say he believed his own concubines were plotting against him. But the fear wasn't limited to the royal family. In the Ottoman Empire, poison wasn't merely the concern of kings. Any position of power, from military commander to court advisor, could be dangerous. Rivals were everywhere, and poison was silent, elegant, and easy to deny. Some substances were preferred over others. Arsenic was common, colorless, tasteless in certain forms, and deadly over time. But there were more exotic choices as well. Crushed gemstones, toxic herbs from the East, even venom drawn from snakes and diluted into drinks. Apothecaries, both respected and feared, sometimes straddled the line between healer and potential assassin. One infamous case told among palace staff involved an advisor who fell ill after eating a bowl of stewed lentils. His symptoms? Sweating, dizziness, and death within hours. The kitchen was searched, and a servant vanished overnight. Nothing was proven, nothing was forgotten. To counteract these threats, food tasters were not enough. The Ottomans developed a system. A second taster might eat first. A steward might test the dishes not just once, but thrice. Once when it was cooked, once when it was plated, and once just before it left the kitchen. A dish might be cooled and reheated to detect tampering. Spoons were scrubbed with vinegar. Some plates were even licked by palace dogs first. A crude but reportedly effective method. Antidotes were another line of defense. The most trusted among these was theriac, a concoction of over 60 ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, ginger, and sometimes snake flesh. Originally Greek in origin, there were also prayers. Religious scribes were sometimes summoned to bless the kitchens. Verses from the Quran were inscribed above doorways. In an empire where divine will and daily ritual intertwined, no defense was considered too small. The paranoia ran deep. Even architectural design reflected it. Some private dining chambers were built with narrow doorways and locked entrances. Meals were sent through rotating compartments to limit human contact. In some periods, the Sultan dined behind a curtain, with only trusted eunuchs allowed near. The food taster, in this web of precautions, was the final line. To be trusted with the Sultan's life was an honor. To die silently in his place was the risk. And sometimes, just sometimes, they did. The daily meals of the Ottoman Sultan were not just about sustenance. They were ritual, ceremony, and spectacle. A quiet performance of empire through food. The Ottoman court believed that the way a sultan ate was a reflection of his power, dignity, and control. His meals were meticulously planned, with an emphasis on order, hygiene, and grandeur, but also on balance and moderation. The palace did not aim to overwhelm with gluttony. Instead, it communicated its vast resources through the variety, presentation, and ingredients used in every course. At the center of this daily culinary orchestra were the palace kitchens of Topkapı, vast halls, where over 1,000 cooks worked in perfect silence. Each cook belonged to a specialized guild. There were bakers, butchers, sherbet makers, pastry chefs, soup masters, and rice specialists. These guilds operated under a strict hierarchy, overseen by the chief of the imperial kitchens, known as the Matba Emini. When it came to the Sultan's meals, security and taste both mattered. Only a handful of the most trusted cooks prepared the actual food for the Sultan. Each dish was tested for poison by the royal food taster before being allowed anywhere near the ruler. The structure of the meal followed a carefully controlled sequence. Typically, the Sultan ate 2 main meals a day, one in the late morning and another in the evening. Each meal consisted of multiple small dishes rather than large servings. A typical royal meal would begin with soup, often made of lentils, chickpeas, or yogurt. These soups were lightly spiced and served piping hot. Following the soup came rice pilafs, which held a place of great reverence in the Ottoman diet. These weren't ordinary pilafs. They were rich, often infused with saffron, cinnamon, almonds, pine nuts, or raisins. Some contained tender lamb. Others sweetened quince or apricot. The rice was always fluffy and aromatic, regarded as a dish worthy of royalty on its own. Then came the main dishes, often slow-cooked stews of lamb, chicken, or beef. These were flavored with pomegranate molasses, dried fruit, or exotic spices like cinnamon and cloves. The Ottomans loved the balance of sweet and savory, a culinary signature inherited from Persian and Arab influences. These stews were cooked slowly in large earthen pots to achieve the perfect texture. Meat was often tender enough to fall apart with a touch. Alongside the stews were roasted meats, small dolmas, stuffed vegetables, and plates of pickled vegetables to cut through the richness. One of the most iconic parts of an Ottoman meal was sherbet, not the Western frozen dessert, but a refreshing drink brewed from fruits, flowers, and herbs. Sherbets were made with sour cherry, rose petals, violet, tamarind, or lemon. These drinks were sweetened with honey or grape molasses and served chilled, usually between dishes to cleanse the palate. As the meal neared its end, desserts took center stage. Baklava was the crown jewel of Ottoman sweets, layers of phyllo dough filled with crushed pistachios or walnuts soaked in fragrant syrup. Halva, made from sesame paste and sugar, was another staple. There were also stewed fruits, honeyed pastries, and confections flavored with rosewater, orange blossom, or mastika, a resin with a delicate pine-like aroma. Every ingredient told a story. Saffron arrived from Persia, pepper from India, cloves from Zanzibar. The spices and delicacies on the Sultan's table were a direct result of the empire's vast trade network and military conquests. The court didn't need to brag. The meal said everything. It's worth noting that despite the abundance, the Sultan himself often ate modestly. He might sample only a few bites of each dish. In part, this was a sign of self-control. In part, it was caution. Too much indulgence could raise suspicion, especially in an age when poison was a political weapon. After the Sultan finished, the leftover food wasn't wasted. Much of it was sent down to feed the palace staff and janissaries, part of an organized distribution system that ensured nothing was thrown away. This cycle of preparation, tasting, presentation, and distribution repeated itself daily, a quiet but powerful ceremony that reflected the strength and order of the empire. Food in the Ottoman court was never just food. In the heart of the Ottoman palace where the Sultan dined, etiquette was law, not just a matter of courtesy, but of survival. Every gesture, every movement around the Sultan's table was dictated by centuries of imperial tradition. And for those who served, silence was not just expected. It was absolute. The Sultan never ate in a public banquet hall. Unlike European monarchs who sometimes hosted grand feasts for the court, the Ottoman ruler dined in private, usually in the Has Oda, or privy chamber. This was a secluded space within Topkapı Palace, accessible only to a select few. Mostly eunuchs, food tasters, senior stewards, and occasionally a favored vizier or prince. The privacy of these meals underscored the sanctity of the Sultan's person. It was a statement. The ruler was above the common fray, both physically and ceremonially. Once inside the dining chamber, everything operated like a silent ballet. The Sultan was always served alone unless he invited a guest, which was rare. Meals were placed in front of him with no word spoken. Bowing was minimal but respectful. Servants were trained to move without sound, often walking barefoot or in soft slippers. Even the clinking of dishes was considered disruptive. Dishes were typically presented on low tables or trays, placed upon rich carpets, following a tradition closer to Central Asian nomadic customs than European courtly style. The position of each item mattered. Water, sherbet, bread, and every dish had its designated place. The royal food taster, having already sampled each dish for poison, would quietly observe from a distance. The taster was trained not to react to flavors or textures, only to watch the Sultan for any sign of discomfort. Even a raised eyebrow could cause alarm. No one interrupted the Sultan while he ate. There was no conversation, no music, no entertainment. This silence wasn't emptiness. It was loaded with meaning. It was about control, restraint, discipline. It reflected a belief deeply embedded in Ottoman culture, that the ruler should command his senses just as he commanded his army. Even indulgence was done in moderation. The Sultan, though surrounded by luxury, was expected to remain composed and sparing. Eating too quickly, too much, or with visible enjoyment could be seen as a sign of weakness. In an empire where rumors of illness or excess could spiral into political instability, even how one chewed a bite mattered. In some reigns, sultans were known to consume only a handful of dishes, sampling small amounts, even as dozens were prepared. Utensils were rarely used. The Ottomans ate with their hands, often using bread as a tool. But even this followed strict form. Hands were cleansed before and after meals, with scented water poured from silver ewers. Towels were folded and offered with precision. Any deviation from this order, a missed hand wash. After the meal, the Sultan would rise or signal discreetly that he was finished. No applause, no praise, no expressions of satisfaction were expected. The moment the Sultan left, the room would be cleared swiftly and silently. The food remaining was redistributed among the inner palace staff, especially the janissaries and kitchen guild members, continuing the cycle of efficiency and gratitude within the palace's hierarchy. Etiquette extended beyond the dining room. Servants were forbidden from making eye contact with the Sultan. Speaking his name aloud was rare. He was referred to, instead, by titles. When a meal was announced, it was often simply referred to as His Majesty's Nourishment. This almost mystical detachment wasn't just formality, it was a protective boundary. By treating the Sultan with such reverence, the court reduced the risk of familiarity and the danger that came with it. Even the food taster, someone who risked his life daily, was not a companion of the Sultan. He was a shadow, valued for his function but never seen as equal. His loyalty was assumed, tested, and monitored, but his presence was always discreet. To the outside world, all of this might have seemed excessive. But to the Ottomans, this meticulous structure was civilization itself. It created order in a world of political plots, rival factions, and deadly ambition. It was etiquette as armor, silence as power. In the hush of the dining chamber, with only the faint scent of saffron and the soft clink of copper lids being lifted, the empire was at its most controlled and its most vulnerable. Because in that stillness, every breath, every bite, and every blink carried weight. One slip could cost a life. When the silver trays were cleared and the Sultan's meals had ended, the royal food taster quietly stepped back into the shadows. But his day was far from over. Though the role was dangerous, highly disciplined, and carried enormous responsibility, the food taster was still human. He had a life beyond the dining chamber, albeit one shaped by strict boundaries and quiet privileges. The food taster did not live among the common servants. Instead, he resided in special quarters within the inner palace, also known as the Enderun. This part of Topkapı Palace was reserved for the most trusted members of the Sultan's household: eunuchs, pages, scribes, and certain elite officials. The food taster's position was both respected and closely monitored. His chambers were modest but clean, usually consisting of a simple wooden bed, a storage chest, perhaps a small writing desk, and a prayer mat. His room was not luxurious, but it was safe. Away from the bustle of the outer courtyards, and close enough to the kitchens and dining halls that he could be summoned at a moment's notice. Despite being surrounded by abundance, the food taster lived with restraint. His meals were nutritious but unremarkable, often consisting of lentils, rice, vegetable stews, and occasionally leftover meat from the royal kitchens. He did not dine with the Sultan, of course, but his food was carefully prepared, sometimes by the same cooks, under strict hygiene and supervision. Ironically, even his own meals might be sampled beforehand by junior kitchen staff, an echo of the system he himself upheld. Leisure was a quiet affair. There were no grand entertainments, no drunken feasts, no wandering into town. The food taster's life was one of careful solitude. He might spend his free hours reading, if he was literate, which many were, or practicing calligraphy, listening to the soft music of reed flutes from the palace courtyards, or simply observing the routines of the palace from a shaded corner. Silence was his companion. Gossip was forbidden. Any breach of trust could lead to punishment or expulsion. Prayer played a central role in his routine. The Islamic call to prayer echoed through the palace 5 times a day, and the food taster, like all devout members of the household, was expected to observe it. These moments offered brief spiritual refuge, a time to reflect, give thanks for survival, and ask for continued protection. In a role where death could come by accident, error, or malice, faith was more than tradition. It was necessity.
When not on duty, he also had responsibilities within the palace hierarchy. He might be asked to assist with food inventories, monitor spice stores, or even mentor younger trainees being groomed for similar roles. Experience was everything, and older food tasters, if they survived long enough, often became silent guardians of knowledge, advising the stewards and kitchen masters on subtle shifts in taste, suspicious patterns, or rumors of dissent. Relationships were limited. The food taster could not marry while in service unless he was released from duty. Intimacy was discouraged. Secrecy was paramount. Most formed quiet friendships with other trusted servants. Bonds built not on words, but on routine, ritual, and shared tension. These were not loud companions, but quiet allies who understood the weight of loyalty. Rare moments of joy did exist. On certain religious holidays or during times of imperial celebration, the palace would relax its formality slightly. Extra sweets would be shared. Music would drift into the courtyards, and the taster might be allowed a longer break, a better meal, or a walk along the palace gardens. But even these small joys were fleeting. The next day's duty always loomed. Some food tasters served for decades. Others vanished quickly, victims of suspected treachery, stomach ailments, or political shifts. Retirement, when it came, was bittersweet. If the Sultan trusted a taster greatly, he might be granted land, a stipend, or a quiet post in a provincial palace. Others returned to their villages as unsung figures, bearing no titles, carrying with them secrets of a world few could imagine. To live as a food taster was to exist in a state of constant awareness, not just of flavor and danger, but of one's own place in the world. It was a life of humility, structure, and hidden courage. And outside the chamber of poison and spice, in the stillness of his quarters, the taster learned to cherish what little peace he could find. A bowl of warm lentils, the call to prayer, the knowledge that for one more day he had tasted death and survived. To serve as a royal food taster was to live on the knife's edge, both figuratively and literally. Every bite carried the chance of death, and yet men willingly stepped into this perilous role. Why? The answer lay in a delicate balance of danger and reward, fear and favor. At the heart of the risk was poison. The Ottoman Empire, like many great courts throughout history, was a place of opulence and paranoia. Intrigue simmered beneath every golden archway, and ambition often took deadly forms. While actual poisonings were rare, the fear of them was real and constant. The taster lived with the knowledge that a single grain of deadly powder, a drop of venom in soup, could end his life instantly and painfully. And, unlike soldiers who faced danger on the battlefield, the food taster's enemy was invisible, tasteless, odorless. It could be delivered by anyone, a cook, a rival, even a friend. Beyond the poison itself, there were political risks. A food taster was always being watched. He was close to the Sultan, and in proximity to power, suspicion bloomed like mold in damp stone. If a taster grew too close, others might whisper. If the Sultan fell ill, the taster might be the first blamed. One wrong look, one false accusation, and the trusted servant could find himself imprisoned, exiled, or worse, executed without trial. Loyalty was not enough. He had to be flawless, but the dangers came with privileges. Despite the quiet shadows he lived in, the food taster held a position of quiet prestige. He was part of the Sultan's inner household, an elite member of the palace's invisible machinery. His opinions were not sought in matters of state, but his presence was known and respected among the higher ranks of servants and stewards. He moved in important spaces. He was familiar with faces that most men would never see in a lifetime. He stood beside power, even if he never wielded it. His pay reflected this closeness. Food tasters were often compensated generously for their service, far better than the average kitchen servant or palace guard. They received stipends in gold coins, regular food allowances, and clothing crafted from fine fabrics. Some were granted jewelry or small estates upon retirement. The Sultan understood that few would take the job without incentive, and fewer still would survive long without reward. More valuable than money, however, was access. The food taster often overheard conversations, witnessed private moments, and developed a quiet intuition about the currents of palace life. He understood who dined with the Sultan, which viziers were favored, which dishes were declined. In a world where knowledge equaled power, this access was a kind of currency. A cautious taster could build quiet alliances, secure future favors, or ensure protection when his service ended. There was also spiritual reward. Many food tasters believed their role was a divine test, a calling to protect the Sultan, who was seen as God's representative on earth. They saw themselves not just as servants, but as guardians, sacrificing comfort and safety for a greater purpose. In Islamic culture, To serve faithfully and without complaint was a virtue. For some, the role held meaning far beyond gold or status. And if the taster survived long enough, he could rise. A trusted food taster might be promoted to kitchen steward or even appointed to roles in other imperial residences. A few exceptional individuals, known for discretion and service, were granted noble titles and land. Others were assigned to protect princes or high-ranking officials. For a boy from a distant village, the road from obscurity to influence sometimes began with a spoonful of risk. But for all the rewards, the question lingered like steam above a simmering pot. Was it worth it? Only the food tasters themselves could answer. For some, the wealth and recognition justified the danger. For others, it was the nearness to greatness, the sense of duty, or the thrill of playing a part in the empire's survival. And then there were those who endured simply because they had no choice. Selected as boys, trained into obedience, too deep to step away. To be a royal food taster in the Ottoman Empire was to live between worlds, not a slave, but never free, not a nobleman, yet intimately tied to power. The risks were sharp, the rewards alluring, and every meal, every moment, every quiet breath in the palace halls was a delicate dance. Food in the Ottoman Empire was never just sustenance. It was a reflection of faith, identity, and imperial order. At the very core of the palace kitchen's function, beneath the hierarchy of cooks and beneath the layers of protocol, lay the sacred expectations of Islamic law. These weren't optional. They were the foundation upon which every bite taken by the Sultan and every dish prepared in his kitchens was built. The Sultan, as both ruler and protector of Islam, was expected to uphold the faith in all things, including what he consumed. This meant that the food prepared in Topkapı Palace had to follow halal guidelines with unwavering precision. No pork, no improperly slaughtered animals, no contamination with forbidden substances. Even the way meat was butchered, with the name of God invoked and blood properly drained, was of the utmost importance. A single failure in this regard wasn't just a culinary mistake, it was a violation of religious trust. This is where the role of trust became critical. Not just trust that food wasn't poisoned, but trust that it was spiritually pure. The royal food taster in this sense wasn't only a shield against treachery, but a guardian of ritual cleanliness. His senses weren't only trained to detect bitterness or strange smells, but to ensure everything passed through hands that honored the laws of God. The imperial kitchens were vast, but tightly controlled. There were separate sections for different kinds of foods, meats, vegetables, sweets, oils, and each had its own set of protocols. Certain foods, such as those used in ceremonial feasts or religious observances, had stricter standards. In this way, the job was both political and spiritual. The food taster wasn't merely defending the Sultan's body, he was upholding the purity of the empire's heart. He was part of an unbroken chain of faithfulness. From the shepherd who raised the lamb, to the butcher who slaughtered it with prayer, to the cook who seasoned it with care, to the taster who ensured it was both safe and sacred. During Ramadan, the kitchens took on a different rhythm. Food was prepared before sunset with even greater scrutiny. Mistakes were unthinkable. Any food offered to the Sultan at iftar, the evening meal, had to honor both fasting and the moment's spiritual gravity. Here, the food taster's role became almost ceremonial. He was a final guardian between ritual and reality. Likewise, during Eid feasts and other religious holidays, meals were layered with significance. Dishes weren't chosen at random. They reflected tradition, scripture, and centuries of Islamic heritage. Sweets like baklava, offered to honored guests, weren't just desserts. They were symbolic offerings of divine generosity. All of this meant that being a food taster required more than caution. It demanded internal purity, humility, and an unwavering respect for the spiritual dimension of food. A lapse in this respect could lead to dismissal, or far worse. It wasn't uncommon for the food taster to be quietly observed by palace scholars or spiritual advisors. His daily prayers were noted, His conversations were sometimes overheard. His relationships were scrutinized. Any sign of irreverence, of carelessness with his religious obligations, could bring suspicion. He didn't just guard the Sultan's meals, he had to guard his soul. To the untrained eye, a bowl of soup might seem ordinary, but to the men who prepared it, to the food taster who examined it, and to the Sultan who received it, that bowl was sacred. It was the final product of trust, tradition, and submission to divine law. And for the food taster, perhaps more than any other role in the palace, that trust had to be absolute. Not only because poison could kill the body, but because impurity could endanger the soul. In the marble stillness of the Ottoman palace, where meals were a form of ceremony and every bite could conceal a threat, the food taster relied on more than instinct and bravery. His tools weren't blades or armor, but patience, observation, and carefully honed techniques passed quietly from one generation to the next. These were methods designed not just to detect poison, but to buy time, to study silence, to let danger reveal itself in its own way. The act of tasting wasn't rushed, it was ritual. When a platter destined for the Sultan emerged from the kitchen, it didn't go straight to the throne room. It first came to the food taster, who worked not under spotlight but in corners, under the watchful eyes of guards and stewards. The first step was always the same: look, smell, feel. A dish that looked too bright, too dull, too off in consistency might be dismissed without a single bite. Familiarity was everything. He knew how the Sultan's pilaf should glisten, how a stew's steam should smell. Even a subtle change was enough to raise concern. Once a dish passed visual inspection, the taster began with the smallest sample, often no larger than a fingernail. The bite was slow, deliberately drawn out. Chewing took time. The taster would move the food around his mouth, feeling for odd textures, metallic bitterness, numbness on the tongue. These were signs often missed in a hurried swallow, but obvious in slow, intentional chewing. He didn't just taste the food, he interrogated it. But perhaps the most critical part of the process was what followed: waiting. The food taster never moved immediately to the next dish. After the first taste, he paused, sometimes for minutes. Guards or stewards stood by silently, knowing not to interrupt. This was the moment of truth, when the taster watched for changes in his body, the beginning of sweat, a flutter in the stomach, a quickened heartbeat. Fast-acting poisons often announced themselves within moments. The delay was not for decorum, it was for survival. This waiting period became part of a staged system. A single meal could require multiple tastings, each separated by intervals. The taster would work through one course at a time, tasting soups, meats, and desserts, with careful breaks in between. Some dishes were riskier than others. Those with strong spices or dense sauces could more easily mask toxins. These received special attention. The taster might revisit them twice, even 3 times before passing them forward. Then there were the moments when the taster pretended. In cases where suspicion lingered but evidence was lacking, the taster might delay service under the guise of inspection. He could claim the kitchen had made a small mistake or that a dish needed reheating. This gave him extra time to observe, to see if a rash developed on his skin, if his tongue tingled, if nausea stirred beneath the surface. Delay was a shield, and deception a quiet weapon. Some techniques were subtler still. A silver spoon, dipped into certain foods, could change color if arsenic or mercury were present. A tiny bird, often a songbird, might be kept nearby and offered a morsel before the taster himself took a bite. If the bird became lethargic or died, the dish was never served. These methods were not infallible, but they added layers of caution to the routine. Every taster had his own methods, often refined through trial and error. Some swore by the smell of copper. Others trusted their pulse, learning how it should feel under normal conditions and monitoring the slightest change. There were even reports of tasters keeping mixtures of charcoal and milk nearby, primitive antidotes that might absorb toxins if taken immediately after a tainted meal. The taster also learned to watch the servers, the cooks, even the guards. A nervous glance, a hand that trembled, a look exchanged across the kitchen, these were as telling as the food itself. A man who watched more than he spoke was often the one who lived longest in this role. Most of the time, nothing happened. The food was fine, the dishes clean, the kitchen steady. But routine never dulled the edge of caution. Every meal was treated as the one that might end it all. The taster lived in a constant state of readiness, his body finely tuned to changes, his instincts honed like those of a hunter. In time, some tasters became so skilled they could taste not only poison, but mistakes in cooking, too much cinnamon in the rice, a sauce left simmering too long. Their palates became legend, respected by chefs, feared by spies. But none of this was for praise or pride. It was for protection. The Sultan never saw this process. He only received his meal once it had passed all tests. He never saw the slow chewing, the long pauses, the furrowed brows, or the slight tightening of the jaw when something felt wrong. He saw only the final product, the perfect plate, carried with reverence. But behind that plate was a man who had faced the same question every day. Will this bite be my last? And he answered it not with bravado, but with discipline, subtlety, and the secret techniques passed down in quiet corridors, from one taster to the next. The kitchens of the Topkapı Palace were more than a place of culinary brilliance. They were a realm of shadows. Within those endless halls of stone and copper, where thousands of meals were prepared each day, whispers clung to the air like the aroma of cumin and lamb. Stories passed from steward to scullion, from chef to food taster, each one tinged with just enough truth to make the blood run colder. One of the oldest tales told among the kitchen ranks was that of Sultan Süleyman's suspected poisoning, a rumor that never made it to court historians, but lived on in the nervous glances of the food staff. The story claimed that one of Süleyman's meals, a lamb stew spiced with cinnamon and dried apricots, had been laced with powdered aconite, a deadly herb known in Europe as wolfsbane. The taster at the time, an older man with sharp senses and failing hands, had supposedly caught the bitterness hidden beneath the sweetness. He reported the anomaly quietly, and the dish was destroyed. Nothing was ever confirmed, but for weeks afterward, 2 cooks disappeared without explanation, and a new set of guards took post outside the kitchens. The story became a warning. Even the most loyal kitchens could be turned into weapons. Another tale, less deadly but just as haunting, revolved around the Sultan's sherbet, a chilled, spiced drink reserved for summer afternoons. According to the whispers, during the reign of Sultan Mahmud I, a strange episode unfolded. Several members of the court fell ill after a banquet, their symptoms identical: nausea, trembling, and fainting. The taster had survived the same drink, and nothing in his reaction suggested danger. Yet the source was never identified. Some believed it was spoiled ice. Others suspected a slow-acting herb introduced by an herbalist with ties to a rival prince. But nothing was proven. From that day on, sherbet recipes were guarded like royal secrets, and tasters doubled their observation periods when sipping court beverages. Perhaps the most enduring myth involved the young concubine who allegedly tried to poison the Sultan out of love, not for him, but for another. As the story went, she had fallen for a palace guard, a man with no future in the harem's tightly controlled hierarchy. In a desperate attempt to escape her gilded prison, she bribed a steward to slip something into the Sultan's bread. Not enough to kill, only to make him fall ill. But the food taster, a man who had once been a court poet before entering service, noticed something off. The bread had an unusual sheen, as if brushed with something foreign. He refused to taste it. That alone was enough to trigger an investigation. The steward was arrested. The girl vanished. Some say she was imprisoned. Others say she was sent to a far-off post under a new name. No one ever spoke her real name aloud again. There were also darker, more absurd rumors of chefs who whispered to the meat before roasting it, believing they could sense guilt in a dish. Of bakers who used birds as sentinels, feeding them crumbs before serving pastries to the royal family. One tale told of a spice merchant who went mad and tried to smuggle crushed emeralds into the palace's saffron supply, claiming the gems would bring eternal life. His plot was discovered when a kitchen boy sneezed violently after grinding a sample. The merchant was never seen again. Not all stories were about danger. Some were legends of honor, like the one about the taster who, upon realizing he'd swallowed a tainted fig, sat calmly in a chair and wrote a letter to his family before the poison took hold.